December 19th, 1944. Snow fell over the Ardennes in heavy silence, muffling the sounds of distant artillery. Beneath the forest canopy, the earth was frozen solid, pocked with craters and footprints that led nowhere. American soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division huddled in foxholes carved into ice, their breath fogging in the bitter air. Their rations were nearly gone. Ammunition was low, and the enemy was closing in from all directions. It was here, in this isolated Belgian town called Bastogne, that one battalion would face the full weight of Hitler's final offensive. They were cold, they were hungry, but they were not broken. The snow was not white anymore. It was gray with smoke and ash. Shells fell with mechanical rhythm, a drumbeat of destruction that echoed through the valley. The ground trembled as tanks rolled closer, the trees shuddering under their advance. The men could see their breath freezing on their rifles, the condensation turning to frost on their steel helmets. Still, they waited. Orders had been clear: hold the line. For the Germans, Bastogne was a roadblock, an obstacle that had to be cleared if the Ardennes offensive was to succeed. For the Americans, it was a test of endurance. In that frozen crucible, surrounded and cut off from supplies, they would face an army twice their size and armed with overwhelming firepower. Yet they refused to retreat. At the heart of it all was the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Men who had jumped into Normandy 6 months earlier, fought through Holland, and now found themselves trapped once again, this time without parachutes, supplies, or hope of reinforcement. The snow around them glittered with fragments of metal and glass. Every explosion sent waves of ice and dirt cascading into their trenches. Every dawn brought the same question: how much longer could they hold? The German offensive, known as Operation Walk am Rhein, had begun on December 16th, 1944. It was Hitler's last desperate gamble, a lightning strike meant to split the Allied forces, capture Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate. It came under cover of fog and snow, when the Allies believed the war was nearly over. The surprise was complete. American lines shattered across a 50-mile front, and entire divisions fell back in confusion. But not Bastogne. The small crossroads town became the anchor of the southern shoulder of the Bulge, a pocket that refused to give way. Its defense fell to the men of the 101st Airborne, supported by scattered units of armor, artillery, and engineers who had been caught in the storm. They had been ordered there by General Eisenhower himself. "Hold Bastogne," he said, "no matter what." The town sat at the junction of 7 roads, vital arteries for the German advance. Without them, the enemy's tanks could not move. That made Bastogne more than a battlefield. It made it the hinge upon which the outcome of the Ardennes would turn. When the Germans realized that Bastogne was holding out, they surrounded it completely. For the Americans trapped inside, there would be no relief, no resupply, and no retreat. They would face not only the Wehrmacht, but hunger, frostbite, and despair. Among them was Captain James Hatch, commanding a rifle company of the 501st Parachute Infantry. His men had been fighting without rest for days, taking turns sleeping in frozen trenches, their hands raw and bleeding from the cold. They had run out of food 3 days earlier. When a resupply drop finally came, it missed its mark, crates of ammunition and rations landing inside German lines. The only warmth they knew came from fires built with broken furniture pulled from the ruins of Bastogne. The German artillery never stopped. Day and night, shells fell in an unending rhythm. The men could tell time by it. 88mm guns screamed overhead, followed by the dull, concussive thud of impact. Each detonation left another crater, another body, another scar on the frozen ground. And still they fought. At dawn on December 21st, a heavy mist clung to the valley as German panzers approached from the north. The lead tank, a Panther, crept through the snow-covered trees, its cannons swiveling toward the American lines. The men of the 502nd Parachute Infantry watched in silence as it drew closer. They had one bazooka left. The gunner waited until the tank was so close he could see the white frost on its hull. He fired. The rocket struck the Panther's side, punching through armor with a flash of fire. The tank erupted in smoke, the crew scrambling from the hatches before being cut down by rifle fire. The forest went quiet again, the echo fading into the hills. That single moment, one man, one shot, one explosion, became a symbol of Bastogne's defiance. In the German headquarters at Wiltz, the high command was growing impatient. General Otto von Manschenfeld, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, demanded that Bastogne be taken immediately. He could not afford to leave a pocket of resistance behind his lines. Every hour the Americans held out was an hour lost for the entire offensive. The snow, once an ally, was now turning against him. His tanks were running out of fuel. His soldiers were starving. The offensive was slowing down, and the impossible defenders of Bastogne were to blame. On December 22nd, a small group of German officers under a white flag approached the American lines. They carried an ultimatum. Bastogne was surrounded, they said. Its situation was hopeless. If the Americans surrendered, they would be treated humanely. If they refused, the town would be annihilated by artillery. The message was carried to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne. He read it, smiled faintly, and gave his reply, "Nuts." The word spread like wildfire through the trenches. Men who had been freezing, starving, and on the brink of collapse began to laugh. It was the kind of laughter that only comes from defiance, from men who knew they might die but refused to yield. The Germans, confused by the slang, had to ask what it meant. The answer came back simply. It means go to hell. That night, Bastogne endured the heaviest shelling of the siege. Buildings collapsed under the bombardment. The church in the center of town burned to the ground. In makeshift aid stations, medics worked by candlelight, their hands stiff with cold and blood. Morphine was scarce. Bandages were cut from bed sheets. There was no power, no heat, and little hope. Yet the wounded still whispered encouragement to the men returning to the line. In the early hours of December 23rd, the clouds finally broke. The sound of engines filled the sky. American C-47s flying low through the pale winter light. Parachutes blossomed above the town, carrying crates of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. For the first time in days, the defenders looked up and smiled. They were not forgotten. The tide was turning. To the men in Bastogne, the battle had become more than survival. It was about proving something to themselves, to their comrades, and to the world. They had been written off as lost, but they refused to vanish. The 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, had become a symbol of resilience. Their stand at Bastogne would echo through history as the moment when endurance became victory. The snow continued to fall, covering the bodies, the craters, the wreckage. The forest was silent again, except for the distant sound of artillery fading into the hills. In that silence, the men of Bastogne waited for dawn, knowing that, whatever came next, they had already held the line. By Christmas Eve, Bastogne had become a frozen fortress. Every approach was blocked by snowdrifts, wrecked vehicles, and the frozen bodies of men who had fallen where they stood. The 101st Airborne was holding a ring less than 6 miles across, surrounded by the might of the German 5th Panzer Army. Yet no one inside the perimeter spoke of surrender. The men had accepted their situation with the fatal calm of soldiers who had nothing left to lose. The command post was set up in a small stone building that had once been a Belgian schoolhouse. Inside, maps were pinned to the walls, their edges curling from the damp. Candles burned low on the tables, casting shadows across the faces of the officers bent over them. Outside, the sound of artillery rolled across the fields like distant thunder. General McAuliffe moved among his men, calm, deliberate, his voice steady. He understood that morale, was the only thing left between them and collapse. The weather had been both enemy and ally. The snow slowed the Germans as much as it did the Americans. Tanks bogged down in frozen fields, their treads choked with ice. Supply trucks struggled to move across the narrow, winding roads. Pilots were grounded by fog and sleet. The same clouds that had hidden the Germans at the start of the offensive now hid the Allies from their own air cover. It was as if the entire war had been reduced to this: two armies frozen in place, waiting for the weather to decide their fate. In the foxholes, time lost meaning. Day and night were measured only by shell fire. The men counted the hours by the rhythm of bombardments and the moments between. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the whistle of incoming rounds or the groan of a wounded comrade. They ate snow to stay hydrated, gnawed on frozen biscuits, and burned scraps of paper for warmth. Letters from home were read until the ink smudged and the paper fell apart in their hands. And yet, something remarkable began to happen. Despite hunger, cold, and exhaustion, the men grew harder. Their bodies adapted to the cold. Their minds learned to shut out fear. They became part of the landscape itself, silent, patient, deadly. When the Germans attacked, they fought not for victory, but for survival. Every shot fired, every inch of ground held, became an act of defiance. Far to the south, in the city of Luxembourg, General George S. Patton was already moving. The Third Army, which had been engaged to the east, began the impossible, a 100-mile pivot north through snow and ice to relieve Bastogne. It was a maneuver that defied logic and weather alike. Patton's tanks rolled day and night, engines roaring through blizzards, headlights dimmed to slits. Men slept on the decks of moving vehicles, wrapped in blankets stiff with frost. Bridges collapsed under their weight. Roads disappeared beneath the snow, but still they came. In Bastogne, the defenders did not know how close relief was. Their radios barely worked. Communications were sporadic, the lines often cut by shell fire. Rumors spread like wildfire that Patton was on his way, that the weather was clearing, that the Germans were retreating. No one knew the truth. They only knew that they could not give up. On Christmas morning, the shelling stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Men waited in their foxholes, staring into the mist. Then came the sound of engines, low, rhythmic, powerful. Tanks. The Germans were launching a final assault. From the north and east, infantry and armor advanced, their silhouettes emerging through the smoke. The ground trembled as panzers opened fire, shells tearing through the frozen air. The American artillery, dug in behind the town, responded with everything it had left. The 105mm howitzers of the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion roared to life, their barrels glowing red from the cold. Shells screamed overhead and exploded among the advancing troops. The snow erupted in geysers of dirt and flame. Men shouted orders, voices hoarse from exhaustion, the words lost in the roar of battle. At the northern perimeter, the 502nd Parachute Infantry took the brunt of the attack. Their lines bent but did not break. When ammunition ran low, they scavenged from the dead. When the artillery fell silent, they fought with grenades, rifles, and knives. One platoon commander was found standing over a trench filled with German dead, his rifle broken, his bayonet frozen to his hand. In the center of town, medics worked without pause. The church that had once served as a hospital was now little more than rubble, but they continued inside, setting broken bones and stopping bleeding by candlelight. The wounded lay on the cold stone floor, their breath shallow, their eyes fixed on the ceiling. Outside, the sky flickered red and orange from the fires consuming the outskirts of Bastogne. By nightfall, the German assault had been repelled. The snow was blackened with soot. The trees along the ridgeline had been shattered by artillery, their trunks splintered like matchsticks. The men of the 101st had held again, bloodied, frostbitten, but unbroken. At dawn on December 26th, A faint rumble came from the south. It was different from the sound of enemy armor. It was slower, deeper, rhythmic. The men listened, holding their breath. Then someone shouted, "Tanks!" And for a moment, panic flashed across their faces. But as the sound grew closer, they heard something else, a faint voice over the radio, cutting through static. "This is the Third Army. We're coming through." The first Sherman tanks of Patton's lead elements broke through the German lines near Assenois, just south of Bastogne. Soldiers who had been fighting in isolation for days stumbled out of their trenches to meet them. Some laughed, others cried. A few simply stood in silence. The siege was broken. The relief column had arrived. But even with the link restored, the battle was far from over. The Germans continued to attack, desperate to retake the town and reopen their supply routes. For another week, the 101st fought side by side with Patton's armor to push them back. When the snow finally stopped and the skies cleared, Allied aircraft filled the air, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Marauders strafing German positions and cutting off their retreat. Bastogne had survived. When the battle ended, what remained was a wasteland of ice and ruin. Trees were stripped bare, their trunks charred. Houses had been reduced to piles of brick and timber. Dead soldiers lay frozen where they had fallen, their faces turned to the sky. The survivors moved through the wreckage in silence, too exhausted to speak. General Patton arrived days later. He found McAuliffe standing outside the ruined town hall, his uniform covered in mud. The two men shook hands. "You did a hell of a job," Patton said simply. McAuliffe nodded. Neither man smiled. There was no triumph here, only endurance. For the 101st Airborne, Bastogne became more than a victory. It became legend. It was proof that discipline, courage, and will could defy even the harshest odds. The men who fought there would carry its memory for the rest of their lives. And though history would remember the Battle of the Bulge as Germany's last great offensive, those who survived Bastogne knew the truth, that the real victory was not in what they gained, but in what they refused to lose. The line had held, the tide had turned, and in that frozen corner of Belgium, the fate of Europe had been decided. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds on December 27, 1944, the forest around Bastogne glowed with an eerie, metallic light. The snow had turned to ash-gray slush, scarred by tank treads and pitted by artillery. The smell of cordite and burnt pine hung in the air. What had once been a silent Belgian woodland was now a graveyard of steel and flesh. The siege of Bastogne was over, but the battle for the Ardennes was not. The German offensive, Hitler's last great gamble, had begun to collapse under its own weight. What had started as a lightning thrust through the Allied lines had turned into a slow, grinding retreat. The roads that once carried the might of the Wehrmacht westward were now choked with wreckage. Burned-out half-tracks, overturned trucks, and the frozen bodies of horses lay scattered along the snowy hills. The same weather that had hidden their advance now trapped them in their own failure. For the men of the 101st Airborne, the relief brought by Patton's Third Army was not salvation, only a brief pause. The fighting continued along the perimeter as the Germans launched counterattacks in desperation. Every yard of frozen soil was contested, every stand of trees filled with the echoes of rifle fire. The men who had survived the siege were gaunt, hollow-eyed, wrapped in rags and bandages. Their faces were cracked from the cold. But when they looked south and saw the American tanks, they knew one thing with certainty: Bastogne had not fallen. In the German command posts, disbelief turned to resignation. The reports coming in from the front lines were grim. Fuel reserves were gone. Ammunition was running low. What had been planned as a decisive strike to split the Allied armies had instead drained Germany's last reserves of strength. General von Manchefeld later wrote that the men defending Bastogne had changed the course of the offensive more than any other factor. The stubbornness of a few thousand paratroopers had delayed the advance just long enough for the Allies to recover, regroup, and strike back. In the skies above, the weather finally cleared. The gray shroud that had covered the Ardennes for nearly 2 weeks lifted, revealing the vast scale of destruction below. Within hours, American and British aircraft filled the air. P-47 Thunderbolts roaring low over the forests. B-26 Marauders dropping bombs on retreating convoys. And transport planes bringing food, fuel, and medical supplies to the troops below. The German soldiers who had once moved with confidence through the snow now scattered for cover. The air war had returned, and with it, the end of their last offensive. The men on the ground barely noticed. They were too exhausted to celebrate. Many had not slept properly in days. Their hands were swollen and bleeding from frostbite. Their boots were stiff with ice. When rations arrived, they ate in silence, sitting on their helmets beside the smoldering remains of what had been a farmhouse or a tank. The taste of hot food was strange after so long without it. For the medics, the days after the siege were worse than the battle itself. They moved through the ruins, collecting the wounded and the dead. In some places, bodies were frozen together in groups, locked in the positions they had died in, hands still gripping rifles, faces buried in the snow. Every patch of ground seemed to hold a story, every shattered tree a witness. Among the survivors was Sergeant Roy Cobb, a paratrooper from Easy Company of the 506th Regiment. He had fought from Normandy to Holland and now to Bastogne, and each battle had left him older than his years. When asked later what Bastogne had been like, he said simply, "It was cold, and we didn't give up. That was all." The town itself was almost unrecognizable. The stone buildings were reduced to shells. The church, the schoolhouse, the market, all had been gutted by fire or shattered by artillery. The few civilians who had remained during the siege emerged from cellars, dazed and hollow-eyed. They spoke in whispers, as if afraid to break the fragile silence that followed the storm. The Americans shared what they could: food, blankets, cigarettes, though they had little to give. In early January, the Germans launched one final counterattack in a desperate attempt to retake Bastogne. It failed. The paratroopers, now supported by tanks and fresh infantry from Patton's Third Army, pushed them back into the forest from which they had come. The once proud armored spearheads of the Wehrmacht were now a collection of shattered machines, their black crosses half buried in snow. By mid-January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. The German army had lost nearly 100,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of tanks and vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. The Allies, though battered and bloodied, had survived. The line that had bent but never broke now pushed forward. In the weeks that followed, the 101st Airborne was finally pulled out of the line. When trucks arrived to take them away, the men climbed aboard without a word. They were thin, unshaven, and numb. As they passed through the wreckage of Bastogne, they saw what they had defended, a town that no longer existed, and yet stood as a symbol of everything they had fought for. Newspapers back home called them heroes. Headlines spoke of the miracle of Bastogne and the screaming eagles who stopped the German army. But for the men who had been there, heroism was a hollow word. They had seen too much, lost too much, to think in such terms. They knew that what had happened in Bastogne was not a miracle. It was endurance, the sheer, stubborn refusal to yield, even when every rational instinct said it was over. When General Eisenhower visited the town later that month, he walked through the ruins in silence. He spoke briefly to the soldiers still stationed there, thanking them for their courage. One of his aides recorded that the Supreme Commander seemed deeply moved. "They saved us all," he said quietly, looking out over the snow-covered battlefield. For the Germans, the defeat at Bastogne marked the beginning of the end. Their armies would retreat all the way to the Rhine, and within 4 months, the war in Europe would be over. But for those who had fought in the Ardennes, the memory of that winter would never fade. It was not a victory won by strategy or technology, but by human will, by men who refused to surrender even when surrounded by darkness. In the months that followed, the survivors returned home. Some went back to their farms and factories. Others stayed in the army and fought on to Germany. Many never spoke of what they had seen. The battle became part of them, something carried quietly, like an old wound that never fully healed. In Bastogne, the locals began rebuilding. The town that had been destroyed was slowly reborn. Children played in the same streets where tanks once burned. New homes rose from the rubble, their stones warmed by the spring sun. And in the fields beyond, the snow melted, revealing the scars of war. The shell craters, the shattered helmets, the fragments of history buried in the soil. For the men of the 101st Airborne, Bastogne was not just a place on a map. It was a memory carved in frost and fire, a place where ordinary soldiers became extraordinary not by choice, but by necessity. They had been told to hold the line, and they had done so against everything the world could throw at them. Years later, when historians wrote of the Battle of the Bulge, they spoke of strategy, of logistics, of generals and movements on a map. But the men who had lived it remembered something different. The sound of snow falling on frozen helmets, the warmth of a cigarette passed between friends, the silence after the last shell had fallen. Those were the moments that defined Bastogne. Those were the moments that made it more than a battle. They made it a legend. That be why the first week of January 1945, the snow that had buried the Ardennes began to harden into glass. The once soft drifts were now jagged crusts of ice that cracked underfoot. The trees stood bare, their branches black against the pale horizon. The fields were filled with silent wreckage, tanks half buried in snow, artillery pieces frozen in place, rifles jutting from the ground like crosses. The wind carried no sound but its own. The Battle of the Bulge was over. What had begun as Hitler's desperate gamble to turn back the tide of war had ended in catastrophe. His armored columns were broken, his soldiers starving, and his dream of dividing the Allied army shattered in the frozen valleys of Belgium and Luxembourg. But for the men of the 101st Airborne, the end brought no sense of triumph. Only exhaustion, only silence. They remained in Bastogne for several more weeks after the siege was lifted. The town was unrecognizable. Nearly every building had been hit by shell fire. Roofs were gone, walls torn open, furniture and glass scattered through the snow. The streets were littered with twisted metal, shattered helmets, and the remains of both armies. At night, fires still burned in the ruins, flickering in the wind like candles for the dead. The soldiers had no time to mourn. They were ordered to secure the area, clear the roads, and prepare for the next phase of the war. German units were still retreating through the forests, and the danger of counterattacks remained. Patrols moved cautiously among the trees, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. They found bodies everywhere, in foxholes, behind walls, beneath the snow. Many were impossible to identify. The cold remained merciless. Frostbite took nearly as many men as bullets. Fingers, toes, and ears blackened from exposure. Medical units worked day and night, wrapping wounds with what little gauze remained. Some men refused evacuation, unwilling to leave their comrades behind. They had survived Bastogne together. They would finish it together. When Patton's Third Army finally secured the southern approaches, a convoy of supply trucks arrived. The soldiers watched as crates of food, ammunition, and winter gear were unloaded. For the first time in weeks, they ate hot food and felt warmth that did not come from burning debris. Yet even as they ate, their faces remained hollow. They had endured too much to celebrate. To the west, Eisenhower's headquarters received the reports. The words were clinical, detached, enemy offensive repulsed, Bastogne secured, Allied counterattack underway. But behind those words was something deeper, the realization that the war was changing. The Wehrmacht's last offensive in the West had failed. From that moment on, the Allies would advance without pause. Germany's defeat was no longer a matter of if, but when. Still, the price had been terrible. More than 80,000 American soldiers have been killed, wounded, or captured during the Ardennes campaign. The fields that had once been quiet farmland were now vast cemeteries of white crosses. The people of Belgium would remember that winter for generations, not for the armies that fought there, but for the endurance of those who survived it. In the following days, the skies cleared again. Allied aircraft returned in force, hunting what remained of the retreating enemy. Long lines of German vehicles moved eastward along icy roads, engines sputtering, fuel nearly gone. The once proud armored divisions of the Reich were now little more than ghost columns. Tanks towed by horses, soldiers wrapped in rags, faces gray with fatigue. They had entered the Ardennes full of confidence and left it in silence. American patrols followed cautiously, reclaiming ground mile by mile. The resistance was sporadic, scattered pockets of men who fought more from fear than faith. Many surrendered at the first sign of encirclement. The once feared panzer divisions were now fragments. In the distance, villages burned, their smoke curling up into the frozen sky. For the survivors of the 101st Airborne, the war pressed on. After Bastogne, they were redeployed toward the German border. The snow began to melt in late January, revealing what had been hidden beneath: the scars of battle. Craters filled with rainwater. Tanks rusted where they had fallen. The ground itself seemed weary, drained of color. As the battalion marched east, they passed through towns still bearing the marks of occupation. Civilians emerged from cellars and barns, pale and thin, waving at the soldiers who passed by. Some offered bread or coffee, their faces filled with gratitude. Others stood in silence, unsure whether to weep or smile. The Americans had become symbols of deliverance, the men who had stood their ground when the world seemed ready to collapse. But the soldiers carried no illusions. They had seen the cost of endurance. They knew that courage was not glory, it was survival. In quiet moments, they spoke of those who had not made it, men whose foxholes were now filled with snow. Friends who had shared cigarettes and laughter before the world turned white and red. Each man carried ghosts now, as real as the weight of his rifle. The Allied command turned its eyes eastward. The push into Germany was about to begin. The Rhine lay ahead, the last great barrier before the heart of the Reich. Beyond it, the cities of Cologne, Frankfurt, and eventually Berlin awaited. The men of the 101st were told they would rest before the final push. But rest was a relative word. Even when the guns fell silent, the memories did not. As February came, the days grew longer. The snow began to recede from the valleys. Meltwater ran through the trenches, carrying away the ashes of war. Farmers returned to their fields, turning up shrapnel and helmets with their plows. The forest slowly filled with birds again, their calls mixing with the distant rumble of artillery. Life was returning, hesitant and fragile. In the United States, the news of Bastogne spread like wildfire. Newspapers printed stories of the men who wouldn't surrender. Photographs of weary, mud-stained soldiers staring into the camera became symbols of resilience. Parents clipped the articles and kept them in boxes. Schoolchildren learned the name Bastogne as a word for defiance. Yet few who read those stories understood what it had truly cost. For the men themselves, fame meant little. They had fought not for glory, but for each other. In foxholes and trenches, in the frozen woods and shattered streets, they had become brothers, bound not by uniform or flag, but by survival. The bond was unspoken, forged in silence and snow. As winter faded, so too did the battle's echoes. The lines on the maps shifted eastward. Bastogne became a rear area, then a name in reports, then a story retold by those who had been there. But for the 101st Airborne, it remained sacred ground, a place where the impossible had become reality. Years later, historians would call it the turning point of the Ardennes. Strategists would debate its significance, count divisions, measure distances, and write footnotes. But those who had stood in that frozen town would remember something simpler: the sound of snow falling between bombardments, the silence after the guns stopped, the faces of men lit by the faint glow of a dying fire. Bastogne had not been about strategy or maps. It had been about will. The will to stand, to endure, to fight when everything around you demanded surrender. And that will, quiet, stubborn, unyielding, would carry those men through the rest of the war, through the long march to Germany, through the return home to a world that could never understand what they had endured. The line had held, and because it had held, the war would end. When spring finally came to the Ardennes, it did not arrive with joy. It came slowly, uncertainly, melting the snow and revealing what winter had hidden. Beneath the ice lay the debris of war. Helmets half buried in mud, rifles rusted and broken, the remains of men whose names were already fading from memory. The forest floor, once white with frost, turned dark and heavy with thawing soil. The land was waking again, but it would never be the same. The Battle of the Bulge was over, and with it, the war in Western Europe had entered its final act. The German army, once feared for its discipline and speed, was in full retreat. The Allies moved forward relentlessly through the Siegfried Line, across the Rhine, and into the heart of the Reich. The men who had fought at Bastogne marched again, this time over ground that bore the scars of a dying empire. Every village they passed through was quieter than the last. Every mile brought them closer to the end. For the 101st Airborne, Bastogne had become part of them. It was no longer just a town. It was a memory carved into their bones, a place where fear had turned to defiance, where cold and hunger had stripped away everything but will. They carried it with them, even as the front lines moved east and the world changed around them. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, many of them did not cheer. They simply sat in silence, staring into the distance, trying to understand how the war that had consumed their youth could end so quietly. The homecoming was not easy. When they returned to America, they found a nation celebrating victory, waving flags, and throwing parades. Crowds cheered them as heroes. But the men of Bastogne knew that heroism was a word invented by those who had never seen war. They smiled politely, waved to the cameras, and said the right things. But at night, when the noise faded, they remembered the cold, the hunger, the silence between artillery shells. Some never spoke of it again. Others told their stories only to those who could understand, the brothers who had stood beside them in the snow. Bastogne itself was rebuilt brick by brick. The people who had survived the siege returned to their homes, or what was left of them. Farmers cleared the fields of mines and shrapnel. Children played in the streets again. The church that had served as a hospital was rebuilt, its walls bearing the scars of the old one. On the outskirts of town, a small cemetery grew, rows of white crosses and stars of David stretching across the green hills. The names carved into the stones were American, Belgian, British, and German, enemies and allies now resting in the same soil. In 1949, veterans of the 101st returned to Bastogne for the first time. They were older, slower, their hair touched with gray. As they walked through the rebuilt town, they were greeted not with fanfare, but with quiet gratitude. The locals remembered. The children who had been hidden in cellars during the siege were now adults. They brought flowers, photographs, and words of thanks that needed no translation. The soldiers stood among them, humbled. Some wept. Others simply placed their hands on the cold stone of the memorial and said nothing. One veteran, a sergeant who had been wounded during the siege, stood on the ridge where his platoon had once fought. The trees had grown back, but he could still see the shape of the battlefield in the land, the slope where the German tanks had come, the line of foxholes that had held. He said later that he could still hear the wind moving through the branches the same way it had that winter. It was quiet then too, he said. Too quiet. But we were still there. Over the decades, Bastogne became a place of pilgrimage. Soldiers, historians, and tourists came from all over the world to see where the line had held. The town built museums and monuments, but the true memorial remained in the silence of the forest. There, among the pines, the past still lingered. The ground was soft again, but beneath it lay the traces of that frozen December. Bullet casings, boots, bits of metal that time refused to swallow. In schools, teachers spoke of Bastogne as a symbol of courage. In films and books, it became legend, the story of men who refused to yield. But for those who had been there, the truth was simpler. It was not heroism that had kept them alive. It was duty. It was loyalty to the man beside them. It was the belief that no matter what, they could not let go. That belief had no medals, no speeches. It lived in silence, in the cold breath of a winter morning, in the sound of boots on frozen ground. Decades later, when the veterans were old men, they returned one last time. They came in wheelchairs, with canes, their medals glinting faintly in the sunlight. The forest was green now, the air warm. They sat in the grass where their foxholes had been and spoke softly to one another, their voices carried away by the breeze. Some laughed, others cried. One man took a handful of soil, black and rich, and let it fall through his fingers. "We left something here," he said, "and it never left us." At the memorial in Bastogne, carved in stone, are the words, "Here was held the line." It is a simple phrase, but within it lies everything: the cold, the fear, the endurance, and the quiet strength of men who refuse to give in. The world remembers their stand as a victory, but for them, it was something deeper. It was proof that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward in spite of it. When night falls over Bastogne today, the town is peaceful. Lights glow in the windows. The fields are green. The forest hums with life again. But when the wind rises through the pines, there are moments, brief, fleeting, when it seems to carry echoes of another time. The low thump of distant artillery, the whisper of men in frozen trenches, the memory of a winter when the world held its breath. And perhaps, if one listens closely, those echoes still speak. Not of war, but of endurance. Not of death, but of defiance. They remind us that history is not written by those who conquer, but by those who refuse to surrender. The snow has long melted. The war is long over. But in Bastogne, the silence still remembers. And in that silence, cold, eternal, unbroken, the line still holds.